This is the Enlightenment lecture for English literature class. When we discuss the different literary eras, you might notice that in maybe another class or something else that you read, that the dates don't match what I'm telling you here. And that's because when society is moving in different directions and changing the way that people think and how people write and how they view the world, there is not a definite start and end date to that. They're very fluid, and that's okay. For the purposes of this class, we are going to say that the dates for the Enlightenment are 1660 to 1800. This word neoclassical refers to the increased influence of classical literature upon these centuries. The neoclassical period is also called the Enlightenment due to the increased reverence for logic and disdain for superstition. Some major events that were going on during that time are the Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, and French Revolution. These are very important that you understand what was going on during these times, so you can connect what people were going through with the philosophies of the day. So the first is the Industrial Revolution around 1750. In England, rural cottage industries, where workers produce goods in their homes, started to give way to urban factories that rely on machine-based manufacturing. Then we have the American Revolution. Rebellion in North America results from Tory influence, unfair taxation, and George III's desire to keep the colonies a producer of raw material that was then shipped to England for processing. Then there was the French Revolution. The revolution ends the Age of Reason, or Neoclassicism, by advancing democratic ideals that destroyed the social hierarchy of nobility, landed gentry, merchants, and professionals, and the working poor. To a certain extent, neoclassicism represented a reaction against the optimistic, exuberant, and enthusiastic Renaissance view of man as being fundamentally good and possessed of an infinite potential for spiritual and intellectual growth. Neoclassical theorists, by contrast, saw man as an imperfect being, inherently sinful, whose potential was limited. They then replaced the Renaissance emphasis on the imagination, on invention, experimentation, mysticism, instead with an emphasis on order and reason, on restraint, on common sense, and on religious, political, economic, and philosophical conservatism. They maintained that man himself was the most appropriate subject of art, and saw art itself as essentially pragmatic, meaning it's valuable because it is somehow useful. And it's something which was properly intellectual rather than emotional. So a lot of art, pieces of art or literature, which is what we're going to look at, talks a lot about the state of man and what does man mean and what are they capable of. And as long as it was pragmatic and intellectual, that means it was valuable. So Enlightenment or neoclassical writers emphasize proper subject matter. In their works, you'll see concepts like symmetry, proportion, unity, harmony, and grace. And those were in their writings they had didactic purpose. Didactic means that it is able to teach you something. During the Enlightenment, some of the most popular prose literary forms were the essay, the letter, the satire, the parody, the burlesque, and the moral fable. If you look at poetry, the favorite verse form was the rhymed couplet. And that type of couplet reached its greatest sophistication in the heroic couplet of Alexander Pope. If you look at theater, you'll see the development of the heroic drama, the melodrama, the sentimental comedy, and the comedy of manners. Here are some main ideas about the Enlightenment or neoclassicism that should be your go-to facts. If you were to remember anything, remember these things. You'll see these ideas and these philosophies throughout all types of works. And the Enlightenment was a wide-ranging intellectual movement. Again, you have to remember that the Enlightenment was a reaction against the ideals of the Renaissance. Okay, so they were moving away from optimism, enthusiasm, spiritual growth, experimentation, things like that, moving toward a more intellectual movement where things were understood through reason and logic. Enlightenment thinkers believe that the natural world is based on reason. Reason is the key to truth. They had faith in nature and belief in human progress through education. This goes back to the Industrial Revolution. People were moving from rural villages to urban settings to work in factories. They had to be educated. They started going to schools. People were educated differently than they ever had before. And that is how Enlightenment thinkers believe that people could progress spiritually, intellectually. This age was also called the Age of Reason. So those three terms, Age of Reason, Neoclassicism, and Enlightenment, are all interchangeable, but they all mean the same thing. And then you have deism, which is the belief in the existence of a God on the evidence of reason and nature only, with rejection of supernatural revelation. Or it's a belief in a God who created the world but has since remained indifferent to it. So deism includes a belief in God, but it's different than how theists would believe that God still, even to this day, continues to reveal himself to us, humans. Enlightenment thinkers believe that God, yeah, he created the earth. We have evidence of that in nature and in reasoning, but he doesn't really stay connected to us today. He's indifferent. So let's talk about literature during this time period. There are some very popular structures that we see in literature, and also themes that are repeated in what we read in the plays that people saw from that time period. So most literature during this time period had a very formal structure that incorporated the use of the heroic couplet, a self-contained statement closed by an end mark. Okay, the heroic couplet you'll find in poems, and these are the two components that you need to remember about heroic couplet. It's rhyming iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter means that when you are reading the poem, there is this rhythm where each line has 5 da-dums, where the emphasis is on that second syllable, that da-dum, okay? So if you hear da-dum, 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 da-dum as the rhythm, you should think that's iambic pentameter. The other element of heroic couplet is that it has a masculine rhyme. That means at the end of your lines, one syllable rhymes. And I'm going to show you an example of that later. Masculine rhyme is different than feminine rhyme. Feminine rhyme is when at the end of the lines 2 syllables rhyme. Okay, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So those are the 2 things you need to remember: iambic pentameter and masculine rhyme. Literature displayed wit, not emotion, and that usually created a detached, urbane tone. Literature was concerned with social matters, and this funnels into the next idea of satire. Satire implies some ideal standard, either human, social, or political, that the author believes man should adhere to. Satire's intention is to use humor or ridicule to persuade and reform. Satire must have a target and state some degree of criticism as well as reform options. Writers use satire, or sometimes called a comedy of manners, in order to poke fun at society, to ridicule people, but it wasn't just for the purpose of humor. It was to persuade people to change or to reform society in general. So satires and comedies of manners were used to show people, how silly are some things that they think or believe, and to provide options for reform. In writings, you'll see an emphasis on reason or presentation of logical arguments. You'll also see similes, elaborate metaphors, lofty diction, and classical allusions. And also during this time, the rise of literary magazines like The Tatler and The Spectator were very popular, and they usually included these formal essays. Okay. Some big names you need to know from this time period: Voltaire, Jonathan Swift, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Pope. We'll look at some of their works in this video and also in class. So those are some names that you should automatically connect to the Enlightenment. They were some of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers and writers. Let's look at an example. This is from Jonathan Swift, one of our big names. This is an example of a couplet. This is an excerpt from The Logicians Refuted. And when we read it, you will automatically notice some very obvious Enlightenment philosophy. Logicians have but ill defined as rational the human kind. Reason, they say, belongs to man, but let them prove it if they can. Wise Aristotle and Smiglesius, with rationation specious, have strove to prove with great precision, with definition and division, homo est ration praeditum. But for my soul I cannot credit them, and must, in spite of them, maintain that man in all his ways are vain, and that this boasted lord of nature is both a weak and erring creature. So you have these couplets that rhyme, these 2 lines that rhyme. This is not a heroic couplet per se because it's not an iambic pentameter, but you will see that this is definitely a witty section of a poem. There is end rhyming, and some of the allusions are classical, so he's alluding to Aristotle. There's Latin in here, so those count as classical allusions. And the subject matter is about humankind, about man. Are they rational? This talks about reason. Okay, does it belong to man? Can we prove it? And then he talks about the idea of a soul. Okay, and there's these ideas at the very last 2 lines, and that this boasted lord of nature is both a weak and erring creature. Okay, so man is sinful, inherently sinful. Okay, they have limited potential. That is Enlightenment thinking. So that's one example. So with that in mind, I have a few questions for you, and I want you to do what we just did. We read a little excerpt and then discussed what was Enlightenment philosophy, or how this tied into what was going on during the time period. I discussed how that was evident in this poem. So I want you to write your answers to the next section on a different piece of paper, because you're going to give that to me. You're going to bring it to class on Friday and give that to me. I'm going to show you a series of quotes from some of these big names, and I would like you to take a few minutes on each just to write in complete sentences how you see Enlightenment philosophy in them, or how you see their form, how they're organized, what they look like, and how those are Enlightenment. Okay, so let's look at the first one. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says, man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. How is that Enlightenment? Number 2, John Locke. All men are liable to error, and most men are, in many points, by passion or interest, under temptation to it. Number 3, Samuel Johnson said, the law is the last result of human wisdom acting upon human experience for the benefit of the public. Thomas Jefferson said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Here are 2 from an Alexander Pope criticism. Be not the first by whom the new are tried, nor yet the last to lay the old aside. Be thou the first true merit to befriend. His praise was lost who stays till all commend. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So I'd like you to write a few sentences for each of those, explaining to me how you see Enlightenment philosophy or form, and we'll discuss on Friday in class. Till next time.